So we'll venture on to our first kit bag in the EB48 2.1 build, and just like most Tekno RC vehicle builds, we start with bag A, the centre differential. Before we get stuck into kit bag A, note that we will also need our bag of fluids and grease. In particular, you will need the tube of black grease as well as the 7000 weight oil. Okay, so now we're ready for the contents of bag A, and if you're familiar with other Tekno RC builds already, then you'll be right at home here. Although everything looks pretty much the same, we have many new parts here though, that were previously optional upgrades. For instance, the diff cup is constructed of the same material but incorporates a new internal design, with higher initial breakaway resistance compared to the original, and it's well suited for bumpy or high traction surfaces. Even the shims that go inside are harder and flatter than before, and the gears themselves have a larger pitch tooth profile that provides more resistance to continuous rotation, reducing the chances of diffing out, while the cross pins are slightly lighter, helping to reduce driveline rotating mass and slightly improve acceleration. So in essence, although the diff looks the same, it's actually rather more refined, yet saying that, it's built exactly the same as before. So we start by applying a little bit of grease to the inside recess where the O-ring will eventually sit. Not too much, just a little, since we'll be greasing the O-ring itself too, just to help create a tighter seal. Next, grab an outdrive and apply some grease around the groove on its neck, and with a bearing on the bottom of the diff cup, slide the greased outdrive through the bottom. Any excess grease can now be wiped away from the outdrive we've just pushed through and used to grease one of the two supplied O-rings, which can then be placed into the neck of the outdrive and pushed down to the bottom of the pre-greased diff cup. Needle nose pliers or another blunt object help to push it right down, certainly nothing sharp enough to damage the rubber though. Now we can lay one of the two differential shims down on top, before inserting one of the two outdrive pins into the hole in the neck of the outdrive. Again, you'll need some needle nose pliers here to help. The pin not only keeps the outdrive and the O-ring in position, it also fits into the groove on the underside of the larger internal gear. Consequently, the gear keeps the pin in place too, so in effect helping each other. I like to add a few drops of the 7000 CST supplied diff oil here, just enough to line the bottom, before dropping the gear into place, ensuring it sits flush with the pin inserted. Give the outdrive a couple of turns to verify the gear is in place. With that done, I like to fill the cup with a little more oil, just enough for the first gear to be almost covered, and let it rest for a moment while we move on to the next step. So we're now ready for our first gear set. Grab two of the smaller gears and feed them onto the gear pin, one on either side. Notice the notch in the center. As you drop these into the groove on the inner edge of the diff cup, take care to keep that notch facing upwards. The gears will be pushed to the outer edge as they mesh with the larger gear beneath. And I like to give the outdrive a gentle wiggle, just to ensure the mesh is in place. On to the second gear set, both placed onto the gear pin. Although this time it will go in with the notch facing downwards, so it crosses and meshes with the previous set, while the outer gears will sit nicely on the bottom gear. At this stage, all gears should be meshed nicely with the bottom. Again, give the outdrive a little wiggle, being very gentle as there's nothing holding the gear set securely down at this stage, and all gears should turn nice and smoothly. We can now top off with some more oil, trying to get into all the tiny gaps, until we are around 1mm from the top of the cup, and that leaves just enough space for the final gear to rest on top. Another little wiggle to confirm all gears are meshed with each other, and we can place the cup to the side for a moment now for the oil to settle, and we turn our attention to preparing our spur gear. Just as we did with the diff cup, we begin with inserting some grease into the O-ring notch of the spur gear, as well as around the notch within the neck of the remaining outdrive. Next, a bearing goes into the opposite end of the spur gear, followed by the outdrive through the gear too, wiping any excess grease as we go and using it to grease the O-ring, which now gets placed around the outdrive and into position within the cavity we just greased inside the spur gear. We then place the final shim into position on top, and push through the remaining outdrive pin to keep everything nicely in place. All we have left now is the small gasket seal, which I like to coat with grease on both sides, before placing into position in the recess within the spur gear. All that's left is to cover and seal the differential with the spur gear, although we need to be careful to not only line up the screw holes without moving the gasket from its position at all, but also to ensure the outdrive pin is seated within the top gear. We then need to seal the unit with the 4 remaining screws. I tend to insert 2 of the screws through the spur gear and gasket, and then slowly lower onto the diff cup. Give them a little turn to secure, and now that we know the gasket is in position and won't move, lower the spur gear down and lock into position. Move the outdrive slightly so that the pin sits into the top gear, and once in place you'll have a complete seal between the spur and the cup. Screw down the 2 screws already in place, although do not tighten just yet. Notice how I use a hand driver to avoid stripping any threads in the plastic cup from using an electric driver. If you do use an electric driver, always tighten down the last bit by hand. And then do the same with the 2 remaining screws. Finally, a little at a time with each opposing screw, in the orientation shown here, tighten into place, taking care not to over-tighten. All screws should be flush with the top of the spur gear. You may find a little diff oil seep through the gaps as you tighten, which you can safely wipe away. With that, the first kit bag is complete. Center differential built and rotating nice and smoothly. Place it to one side for now, and I'll see you in the next part in the series where we move on to kit bag B.